odds are really good that your understanding of how the Revolutionary War started and the politics involved is probably not all that good. And there's a reason for that. Now, whenever I'm teaching a class, one of the first things I like to explain is what are the things that get in the way of our understanding of what actually happened. Well, in this case, we have to realize that there were essentially two revolutions. There was the revolution against distant British colonial rule, and then there was a revolution against the Articles of Confederation government. Essentially, a political battle was won or fought, and the victors wrote the history. Uh, Ultimately, the victors, the Federalists, or to be more accurately described, nationalists, wrote a history that was nationalist in nature, when in fact the revolutionary government of America was anything but nationalist. Uh, Very clearly, it was oriented on each individual state. Uh, Nationalist history writers would downplay this effect of things and try to paint a more nationalist view of things. So that's why we get this whole effect of the United States fighting against Britain, when in fact it was British America fighting against the British Empire. We only became Americans uh, as the conflict went on. Another problem is what we call birth mythology. All countries that go through any kind of birthing process, look at Rome with Romulus and Remus, uh, the French Revolution with its Bastille Day. The birthing process of a nation always causes mythology to come up because you want people. Obviously, if people go to such great lengths as to make a new nation or remake the government in a radical way, uh, what ends up happening is they have to point out just how horribly bad the previous system was and how wonderfully good theirs is. Because if it's just marginal differences between the two, it doesn't really seem like much of a good reason to make a whole new nation. So these birth mythologies uh, obscure reality. Now, the United States has a bigger problem is we actually have two births. We have the revolutionary birth and we have the constitutional birth. And there's massive mythologies around both these events. Then once we get past the Civil War, uh, all understandings that are not nationalist are pretty much gone because we've the establishment is fully nationalist at this point, and the only form of history they want taught is nationalist in nature. So let's understand a little bit about what's going on in British America. One of the things I always like to point out as a distinction, a lot of people know this, but hearing it again and knowing it in context helps a little bit. Now, one of the mythological things that got added to our history much later on was the idea that when Paul Revere and his other compatriots were riding to warn people on the eve of the War of Lexington and Concord, that they were shouting the British were coming, which makes no sense in context because those people considered themselves British too. Perhaps British Americans, but they do consider themselves British. So, uh, if they consider themselves British, they would never say that. Actually, they were saying the regulars are out. Okay, So uh, the idea of true Americanism takes a while to take root. Essentially, as the various British tax acts are imposed to pay for the French and Indian War, more and more people are starting to lean towards the idea of us being different from the British. But it probably doesn't really fully take hold till probably well into the Revolutionary War itself. So, looking at pre revolutionary America, we need to understand the governments in order to understand what the process was that brought us to a revolutionary war. And the process is pretty much entirely within the establishment of America. Okay, so the first thing to know is that the capitals of all the colonies tended to be very close to the coast, and most of the colonies basically had long footprints going inland. Uh, these capitals were not central, and this caused several problems. One, of course, is the capitals were located where the merchant class was, which allowed the merchant class to dominate the governments. The further inland you went, just a combination of distance made it difficult for you to get representation, and it made it difficult to travel to make it to various governmental events. So even if you were some form of representative from the interior, you frequently didn't make it in as much as the people who were closer, which means that you didn't get to influence things as much as you would like. Typically, the colonies were drawn up with smaller coastal counties and much larger inland counties. So these smaller coastal counties, so if they had any kind of delineation where they were, had county representation and popular representation, they could dominate both houses of their legislatures because the coastal counties tended to have a similar mindset to each other, whereas they were often at odds with the interior counties. As I noted, the governments were dominated by the merchant class, and the merchant class lived on the coast. So things that would be beneficial to the interior were not particularly of interest to the merchants. Something else to take into consideration is the interior road system at the time was so bad, it was often easier to travel from one colony to another by ship than it was to travel within your own colony from the capital to the interior. Or in other words, you could get to another state colony faster than you could the interior of your own colony. Another issue of this government was public voting, whereas they did not do secret ballots. Essentially, they would assemble as groups, people who had the privilege to vote, and things would be done by a show of hands. Now, if you thought a particular person running for government was a really bad choice, but you had some form of business ties or loans to the person or whatsoever, you might be inclined to vote publicly differently than you would have if you were able to vote privately. Another problem of the time was duplicate office holding. A lot of officials often had multiple offices within government. And this led to corruption, abuse of power. Basically, an office that was supposed to be kind of the check against another office couldn't be because the same person was occupying it. So, one of the big features of pre revolutionary America was revolutions or revolts against the coastal capitals from the interior. One of the things I recall, one of my first college level history classes talking about America, is Bacon's Rebellion came up. And my instructor was really adamant to explain to us that this had nothing to do with the revolution. Nothing could be drawn about it. It's a completely isolated event, doesn't fit whatsoever. Except the problem is there's a bunch of these isolated events, and if you look at them, you start realizing there is a pattern. Virtually every colony had some kind of interior rebellion. Most of them before the Revolutionary War. Some were continuing as the Revolutionary War started, and some occurred immediately in its aftermath. I'll do a quick list of it just to give you an idea how much of this was going on. Of course, we had Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, which I do believe they ended up burning the Capitol on that one. Good for them. Culpeper's Rebellion in North Carolina. Leisler's Rebellion in New York. Carey's Rebellion in North Carolina. New Jersey tenant riots. The Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania. The Regulator Movement in North and South Carolina, which I believe was ongoing during the Revolution. The Black Boys Rebellion in Pennsylvania. Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts, and the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. Of course, Shays Rebellion was after the Revolutionary War, but before the Constitution, and it's a very critical piece in getting us to the Constitution, but we'll talk about that in another video. Of course, the Whiskey Rebellion was one of the last interior rebellions that occurs. So the main issue was that the coastal elites, primarily the merchants, were the establishment of British America. That establishment was primarily interested in milking their colonies for whatever advantage they could get for their class. The interior, both underrepresented and poor, tended to be the target of property taxes and various other things that made their lives more difficult. And they viewed themselves as being ruled by a distant capital, in some ways like some of us do with Washington, D.C. today. And so these would turn into popular uprisings, some of which, like Bacon's Rebellion, had some level of success. These are not isolated incidents. These are actually the social fabric of British America itself. We are seeing the establishment as being very non-populist. They're working in the interest of their own group, and essentially they have a poor rural farmer be damned attitude of things. So now you have to understand what starts happening. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole movement of how we get to the revolution. I may do that in another video, but I think most people who are watching this are aware of how the French and Indian War altered Britain's view of British America. Essentially more oversight, more taxes, more troops, which essentially started chafing against the various groups of America, British America. So one of the biggest problems that started happening was these taxes tended to fall more on the merchant class and the rich plantation owner class than they had in the past. And so this starts creating an agitation in the establishment for change. And initially, for the most part, the establishment is looking for some kind of alteration of the status quo, but they haven't fully made up their minds of what is going on. Of course, the events of Lexington and Concord start altering that. Now, one of the things that just gets completely overlooked in most histories is the revolutionary provisional governments that formed up at this time. Massachusetts is pretty wild because essentially what happens is the legislature of Massachusetts is essentially shut down. The government is put under a royal governor who is pretty much functioning by decree. And so Massachusetts colony creates its own shadow government, literally moving from place to place and reconvening, issuing orders, and doing the things the government does. And little by little, this provisional government movement spreads to the other states. And in some cases, you have both governments functioning at the same time. And eventually, the provisional governments eclipse the royal governments that are put in place. Now, if you've ever seen the musical 1776, or you've ever watched the miniseries John Adams, you'll see when they're talking in the Philadelphia phase of things, there's this point where they're waiting on delegations to come from the states, colonies, to provide new information to the or new instructions to the delegates who are already there. This is the process of the provisional governments asserting themselves. Because some of the delegations arrived, they were still under instruction from the pre-revolutionary governments. By the time the Declaration of Independence rolls around, almost all of them are getting direction from their provisional governments, with the exception of New York, who abstains courteously, if you remember seeing that. So, this is where we need to look at what's going on in the establishment. Now, of course, part of the establishment is very aghast at what's starting to happen. They're, terrified because they say, well, we're doing quite well here. If we just kind of weather this and go through, I'm sure on the other side everything's going to be fine. And then you had another class that was more opportunistic. And this is the one, but the first ones, of course, we'd call the Tories, or Royalists, perhaps. The second group is the one you probably never heard of, and these are the Unionists. Now, the Unionists are actually the core of our nationalist movement. Very interesting things they were attempting to do. Their goal was they wanted the British America to be formed up very similar to the way Scotland was formed up in the United Kingdom, where Scotland had its own parliament, and the parliament answered to King George III. So what the Unionists wanted to do was unite all the colonies under one single entity called British America. And British America would be ruled by a parliament. And that parliament would answer directly to the king and no longer answer to the British parliament. And this is a significant movement. And you will not hear about them most of the time for a very important reason. Because even though they lose the first revolution, they're major players in the second. So their story very frequently is ignored because it makes everything kind of awkward. And of course, then we have essentially the pro-independence people. And initially they start off tepid, but they get more and more. And you'll see that the big plantation owners are a big mover in this. Some of the merchants, like Hancock, who are essentially doing merchanting on the side, almost piracy. Well, not really piracy, smuggling. And this group eventually comes full force with the idea of independence. So what ends up happening is you have the establishment of America breaks in three. Tories, Unionists, and Independents. The exact percentage breakdown, don't really know, but it's probably close to a third each. So, how do we get from there to the step we're starting to more recognize. Well, obviously, the independence people couldn't find common ground with the Tories at all. I mean, they made a few attempts, the Olive Branch petition and other things like that, in order to try to fix things up, but they really couldn't find common ground. And the Unionists, because they were looking to essentially eliminate the individual colonial governments in favor of one big national government, couldn't find ground with either group. And so you have an establishment that's kind of rudderless. So what happens is the independence-minded people who are in the establishment form an alliance with the rural interior. So essentially the rural interior that's been uprising against the coastal elite for over 100 years now has their own voice, where these establishment independents say, yeah, we'll be your voice. You know, we will be the ones who help carry you forward, and you be the muscle that makes this work. So that's what makes the revolution possible, because no particular faction of the establishment was now strong enough to do it on their own. And so the independents allied themselves with the rural interior, thus giving them the actual power to do something. And what follows is independence and the Revolutionary War. Okay, so here's a concept you need to understand desperately to understand anything about this period, and probably at least till at least 1800, if not a little further beyond. And this was a concept called the disinterested man. Now, if you got somebody who claims to be a constitutional expert of any kind, ask them about the disinterested man. If they have no idea what it means, they're not a constitutional expert. Essentially, this was a concept that came out of England. In order to be a member of government in England, it wasn't a rule, it was just kind of a gentleman's code. You were expected to be disinterested, literally separating yourself from your interests. You could not really be a business owner, and investment, unless it was some kind of blind investment, was kind of discouraged. Essentially, you either had to be independently wealthy or a landlord. They considered the tenancy laws to be so secured in England that a landlord had no true interest because he couldn't alter the way things were set up. And so in England, it was pretty much if you had to be disinterested in order to make it into government. And of course, British America, being schooled in all things British, this idea comes over with them. But the problem is the economics of the British America are completely different from the home island. It's almost impossible to be disinterested in the same way the British on the home island are. Landlording is almost impossible in this country because anyone who wants land can just move a little bit further out. So what ends up happening is the American establishment decides that, well, since we know we're supposed to be disinterested, and even though we aren't truly disinterested, the fact that we know we're supposed to be is good enough. And this kind of sets up so the thing is, they had their idea of who was a respectable person in government and who wasn't. Well, clearly, the coastal elite were good candidates as far as they were concerned for these pseudo-disinterested men. Anyone from the interior clearly didn't fit the bill because they didn't, even though they weren't any less disinterested. Basically they had interests. The coastal elite had interests. They just knew they weren't supposed to have them. But the interior people had interests, but they didn't know they weren't supposed to have them. So this created this class system of who should be in government and who shouldn't. The independents broke this rule by basically bringing in the interior people who didn't know they were supposed to be disinterested, even though they weren't either. So what ends up happening is we get to the point where the revolution is in full force. We have events occur like where the British are forced out of Boston. And eventually, in that process, a lot of Tories leave the country, as do some of the Unionists. When the war inexplicably comes to a conclusion where the government of the Articles of Confederation end up triumphing over the British and get a peace settlement, an interesting thing starts happening. Now, it's well chronicled that a lot of people moved out of the United States and headed to Canada and other places within the British Dominion. But what isn't mentioned a lot is a lot of them actually came back too, especially establishment types, people who had businesses, people who had lots of property. And they, having more in common with their other fellow establishment people, were able to work things out where they would go, the independence people would go talk to their people and say, hey, they're really us after all, even though they were supporting the wrong side or they had some wrong ideas. We have to welcome them back. And so the independents ran interference for the Unionists and the Tories who returned. So once we're in this post-revolutionary period, the establishment is looking upon the provisional governments and the Articles of Confederation government with a huge amount of disdain because it's overpopulated with interested men in their mind, even though they were only pseudo-disinterested at best. So, as establishments do, they eventually found a way to reconcile. And led by the Unionists, they conspired to come up with a new governmental system. They created the foundations of the Constitution in a bunch of different meetings that occurred around the nation. And then when an opportunity arose during the drafting of the Articles of Confederation, the entire establishment joined forces in order to pass the Constitution. Now, it's interesting if you start looking at like Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers and other writings, discussions that went on in the various state conventions, you can see that there's a lot of dissent over how things are going to go, but a lot of them are willing to make concessions in order to make this happen because they did not like the revolutionary governments of the colonies. They did not like the Articles of Confederation government. So they were willing to compromise a lot in order to get that. Now, this overwhelming spirit of compromise had a lot more to do with how well the Constitution turned it out in the end, rather than it being this well crafted. It's not like it was this well crafted idea that formed in Madison's mind and was set forward and everyone looked at it and said, yea, verily, it's great. He came up with core concepts and then everybody piled in and tweaked it. And everybody was willing to accept it to a certain level. Like if you look at someone like Hamilton, who probably didn't believe most of the core tenets of the Constitution, but was willing to accept it if it achieved unity and nationalization, because he looked at it as a stepping stone to something bigger and better. And then people on the far other end of the spectrum said by the time all the compromises occurred, they said, this government's weak enough looking where we can tolerate it. And so what happens is the establishment comes together, creates a document that some of them love and others are willing to hold their nose and vote for, and they all go out and campaign. They bring it to the public, and since their strongholds tend to be in the populous cities, they are able to use this advantage to, in some cases, only barely bring our Constitution in existence. I'll talk a little bit more about the convention in Philadelphia and the state nominating conventions in another video, but this is essentially how we came to be. We had an establishment that was very uninclusive in the pre-revolutionary times. When the politics got too bad for the establishment broke in three and became ineffective. And then a portion of the establishment allied itself to the rural ruffians in order to use them as political leverage. Now, one aspect that comes out of our Constitution is this idea. So there is a duality where, on one hand, it's a republic designed for the establishment, yet it has elements, House of Representatives being an example, where the general populace has the potential for input. And the idea was they wanted a government by establishment that had some populist mechanisms that could intervene if things got too out of whack, like they did during the pre-revolutionary period. But they did want the establishment firmly in control. Now, is one of the things that a lot of people misunderstand is they look at people like Madison and Washington and several others who speak ill of the idea of political parties forming. And modern people look at these statements saying, oh, well, they didn't want our party system. That's what they're talking about. Well, that's kind of it, but what they were really saying is they wanted a united establishment running the country. And the Constitution was meant to be the method of putting the establishment back in control of things. And to a greater extent, that's what it ended up accomplishing. All right, so hopefully you have two new terms in your vocabulary: disinterested man and unionist. Hope you learned something. Please like the video. If you have comments, please make them. I have a tendency to answer them as I can. And look forward to seeing you next time we do a video.